Now, as you know, we did the Mishnah, and the Mishnah was as follows. We started this discussion with Rav Yochanan, which Akiva read yesterday. If two potters were walking one behind the other in the public domain, and the first one stumbled and fell, and then the second one stumbled over the first one is liable for damages to the second. Okay? Now, I'm just going to do a summary. So the Gemara explains the Mishnah. Rav Yochanan said, do not say that Mishnah is only with Rabbi who says that one who stumbles is considered negligent, and that this is why the first potter is liable. Rather, even according to the sages who say that one who stumbles is considered the victim of an unavoidable accident and therefore is not liable, in this case, the first potter is liable because he could have stood up after he stumbled and he did not stand up. So that's the reason for his liability, not that him stumbling was considered negligent, but he should have stood up after the point at which he fell. So there's a dissenting view. Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak said, even if you were say that our Mishnah refers to a case we could not have stood up in time. Why? Because he fell and his body was a bit shocked and his mind was a bit shook up. It refers to a case that he is liable even according to the sages. And on what basis is he liable? Because he should have warned the person behind him and he did not warn him. So here Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak quite clearly says, listen, even if a guy couldn't get up in time, all he had to do is shout, stop, I've fallen. And in that case, even if his body wasn't immediately recoverable, he could have shouted that warning to stop the second person from falling over him. But Rav Yochanan doesn't agree. Why? He said since he couldn't get up in time, he could not be expected to warn the other person either because he was preoccupied. What do we mean he was preoccupied? Well, if you fell down very hard, not only is your body a little bit wrecked, but you're in shock mentally and emotionally, and you're not in the presence of mind you're preoccupied to warn the person behind you. And therefore, if you're not in a fit state to have gotten up in time, you're probably not in the right mental and emotional state to have the presence of mind to warn the person that's behind you. Okay? And so it emerges that Rav Yochanan and Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak disagree as to whether a person who fell is expected to warn other people before he had a chance to rise. Right, now we're going to discuss the proof to one side. We learn in a Mishnah, if the owner of a beam was first, in other words, he was walking in front, right? And the owner of a barrel was behind him. And the barrel broke by the beam. The owner of the beam is not liable. Okay? So why is he not liable in this case? Because the one that was carrying the beam was walking at a normal pace, and the one that was carrying the barrel was walking too fast. This is according to Rashi. Now, this actually mimics a discussion that Gavin had with us yesterday. He said in that case, if you're driving too fast in the car, the one behind is actually liable because he's not following the correct, what you call it, safety distances, and he's speeding. So this Gemara, now this explanation, according to Rashi, is explaining exactly Gavin's point, right? When the one behind was negligent and therefore is liable. However, say the person walking with the barrel is walking at a normal pace, and the owner of the beam stopped and the barrel broke on the beam. In that case, the owner of the beam is liable. So why is he liable? For Gavin, for the exact case that the guy behind wasn't overpacing himself. He was walking at a normal pace, and the guy with the beam just suddenly stopped in the public domain. And it's not normal in a public domain to stop. Why? Because the public domain is known as what you call a walk-through thoroughfare area, where animals move and people move. You can think of it like a road or a highway. A car just suddenly can't stop in the third lane because other cars are going to smash that. That is a minimum of 80 or 100 kilometers an hour on a highway. I'm not quite sure what it is. But on the very right-hand lane, people are going at a minimum of about 120 kilometers an hour. Does that make sense, Gav? So that answers your question. Now, what's happening in this particular case is So the owner of the beam is liable only in the case where he suddenly stopped and the other guy behind him was pacing well. Now, does this last clause not refer to a case where the owner of the beam stopped to adjust the load on his shoulder, which is a normal thing for him to do? So what it's saying here, guys, is that there are certain normal things to do in the public domain and certain not normal things to do. One of the normal things to do is that if you're going at a very, very if you're carrying a very heavy load in the public domain, like a beam, etc., you need to adjust it on your shoulder because you could injure yourself or drop that wooden beam. So in that particular case, it's absolutely normal to want to adjust it on your shoulder every now and again. So that's not deemed an irresponsible behavior. But what is deemed an irresponsible behavior is suddenly stopping in the public domain to rest. It's the equivalent of stopping in the middle of a highway because you want to see the scenery. It just isn't appropriate. And that's where the liability lies. So how do we know this? Let me read on. We learned in the Mishnah, if the owner of the beam was first walking in front and the owner of the barrel was behind him, and the barrel was broken by the beam, the owner of the beam is not liable because obviously the person that held the barrel was walking too fast and didn't keep the correct pacing. But if the owner of the beam stopped and the barrel broke on the beam, the owner of the beam is liable. Why? Because in this particular case, the barrel owner was walking at a normal pace and the guy just stopped all of a sudden. So, doesn't this refer to a case where the owner of the beam stopped to adjust his load on the shoulder, which is a normal thing for him to do? Meaning, how do you make the guy that has the beam liable for the fact that he does have to adjust something that's very heavy on his shoulder and it's not deemed as being irresponsible? So the Mishnah teaches he's liable, which can be explained only if one maintains that he should have warned the person behind him. Hence, the Mishnah proves that one can be held accountable for not warning others, even when he is preoccupied. So the discussion here is as follows, is that when your activities are normal, and in other words, because of the weight of the beam, you weren't just relaxing or resting, you weren't being negligent, that in that case, you shouldn't be liable. So why are you liable in this case? Because it can only be explained if you maintain that while you're adjusting the beam, or just before you did it, you warn the other person behind him saying, stop, the beam's heavy, I need to adjust it on my, please wait.
I'll be there now, thanks. Guys, sorry, I have to go. I'm coming back now. I've just got to, guys, come to collect something, sorry.
All right, we'll wait.
Sorry, I apologize.
Okay, Damon, so you're saying the person must, the person in front has to be cognizant of the guy behind him.
Absolutely.
At all times.
All times. Why? Because even if you had were in a vehicle, you've got to be cognizant of the person in front of you and the person behind you. How do you know you have to be cognizant of the person in front of you? Because Rabbi Meir said that if you smack the person in front of you or you fell, you're liable.
You're liable. Like as in traffic, motor accidents, yeah.
It's exactly the same. And the person behind you, you've got to be cognizant. So you've got to hoot if you have to come to a sudden stop, or try and veer out the way to not cause an accident.
So what they're saying is maybe the guy in front that stumbled may not be liable for the guy behind him.
No, all arguments
incurring damages. Accruing damages.
They say he's liable for three reasons, okay? If you hold according to Rabbi Meir, he's liable because stumbling is not considered an accident. He should have looked where he was going. If you hold according to the sages, that it is an unavoidable accident, he's not liable for that. We're talking in a case where he fell and he could have got up in time and he just took his time to get up. That's according to the sages. Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak said his problem isn't that he couldn't get in time, because even if he couldn't get up in time, he should have warned the person behind him, saying, I can't get up, I'm injured, stop. So according to all opinions, he's liable for those three reasons. And I can't even say that Rabbi Meir would hold a person liable in a case where just because another person was injured, it's not the other person's fault that he was injured, even if it's an accident to you. Remember, we learned a case according to Rava and Abaya that had this discussion that Rabbi Meir would even hold somebody liable if they had a picture and the shoulder strap broke for a factual defect. Why is it his fault? It might not be his fault, but the point of it is, why is it the other person's fault? They tripped on him. Maybe he went to buy on the cheap mode, and since he bought an inferior product in some level, it is his fault. And even if it's not, why should, if your car suddenly like seizes, another car behind hits in front of it, and it might be the engine, but how is it the person's fault that hit you? Is it his fault if you suddenly stop without any warning? So these are some of the discussions that are had. So here we're talking about a different case, Kevin. Here we're talking about that last point of saying culpability with the guy on the beam and the barrel. We're saying is as follows, is that if the guy behind wasn't keeping the right falling distance and he was walking too fast and he smashed into the guy with the beam, because the beam is very heavy to walk with, and the guy with the barrel just smacked into him, the guy with the beam it's not his fault, because the guy in the barrel should be aware that the guy is carrying a very heavy item. But if he's pacing naturally and the guy in front just stops to look at the scenery, when in fact there has to be traffic flow in the public domain, then the beam owner must pay for the damage. Fine. That we've established. But now we're saying, what happens if it's a case where he has to adjust the load on his shoulder? Why would he have to adjust the load on his shoulder? Because the beam is very heavy. So that's a normal thing to do. To just stop and look at the stars and rest is not normal in the public domain. But to take something that's heavy and readjust it on your shoulder is normal. So how could he be expected to be liable? So the Gemara is saying the only way you can expect him to be liable is if you say his failure to warn that's what causes his liability. Does that make sense? Okay.
Guys, I'm back. I'm so sorry.
All right. No problem. Gav, can I give you a one-sentence summary?
Yeah, sure. Appreciate it.
All right. So listen, just quickly, Kevin asked a question. I want to just give a 1 or 2 sentence summary on everything. He said, but hang on, why is the person in front liable? I said for 3 reasons. Rabbi Meir would hold him liable because falling is considered an act of negligence, because you should look where you were going and have the presence of mind to watch your step and focus on what you're doing. Fine. The sages say it's an unavoidable accident, and therefore that's not why you're liable. You're liable because you had the physical capacity to get up in time. It wasn't really such a traumatic fall, and you didn't do so. So your inability to get up in time is what makes you liable. Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak turns around and said, that's not the reason why you're liable. Because even if you feel a bit body shocked, you could just turn around and say, guys, I fell, just wait, stop. So there's failure to warn according to Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak, the reason for liability. Rav Yochanan says he doesn't agree. Why doesn't he agree? He said, listen, that's shell-shocked because you fell bad and you can't get up in time. You're probably emotionally and mentally not in the presence of mind to warn somebody because you're preoccupied. Fine. That part of the Mishnah is done. Bang. Next part of the Mishnah. You talk about a beam and a barrel. This addresses your issue. What's the issue that you address? You said that the guy behind in South African road law is liable because he should have kept the correct following distance and not driven at a speed. So we're saying that's exactly right. If the guy with the barrel behind is walking at such a heavy pace and he doesn't realize the guy in the front is struggling with a heavy beam, he's a moron. And therefore, if he smashes the barrel on the beam, he's responsible. It's not the beam owner's fault. So he's saying, well, when is the beam owner liable? It says, well, basically, the beam owner is liable if he's in the middle of what you call traffic thoroughfare, like being on the highway, and you just stop the car to look at the cows grazing in the field next to you. You know, you think you've got all the time in the world, and there's a pace. So if he's just stopping to rest and relax, it's not the place to stop and rest and relax. But they're saying if you're adjusting the beam because it's very heavy, that's a very normal activity, so it doesn't slip off your shoulder and it's hurting you. That's normal. That's not a problem. So then, why are you liable in that sort of case? You're only liable because you failed to warn the guy behind you, because you should have had the presence of mind to say, guys, it's heavy. I need to adjust the load. Just wait. And your failure to warn is what makes you liable. So this is a proof for Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak. Do you understand what I'm saying?
100%.
Good. Let me go on. All right. I'm sorry, guys, about the quick summary, but I mean, you guys are intelligent. We can go on. The Gemara answers, no, the Mishnah refers only to a case where the owner of the beam stopped to rest. This is abnormal use of the public domain. He is liable even if he is not expected to warn his fellow. So, in other words, he's saying, listen, it seems that you might be only liable if you stop to rest. So the Gemara challenges this answer. And it says, hang on, but according to this answer, what is the law if he would have stopped only to adjust the load on his shoulder? Okay? So the law is that he is not liable. So this is proving what? It's proving that if he did the normal activity of adjusting heavy weight on his shoulder, that's deemed that he's not responsible because he wasn't doing anything negligent. But if he stopped and just looked at the scenery when there's a heavy traffic flow and people are moving quickly, he is liable. So the Gemara is saying, hang on a second. If so, instead of teaching in the end of the Mishnah, but if the owner of the beam said to the owner of the barrel, stop, he is not liable. The Tana should have taught a distinction between liability and non-liability in that very case. In other words, where the owner of the beam stopped without giving a warning by stating, when is this the law? The owner of the beam is liable if he stopped stated, where he stopped to rest. But where he stopped only to adjust his load, he is not liable. Okay. So what the Gemara is saying, listen, why didn't the Mishnah reword it in the following way? It said, listen, there's a way to have liability and a way not to have liability. He is liable if he stops when there's a car on the highway or there's a quick pace in that public domain. We're not talking about the pedestrian sidewalk where you can walk at your leisure and stop and look at the shops. We're talking about where animals are moving quickly and people are moving quickly, where there's a certain expected pace. If the guy just stops to look at the scenery, he's liable because, somebody could smash into him. So where he stopped for no reason, like to rest, that's not appropriate. But if he had a very heavy load and he needed to adjust it on his shoulder so it didn't damage the load or his shoulder, that is reasonable. So there's non-liability. So the Gemara
mustn't that come with the warning as well? When he stops, he can't just stop.
Let me just cover a bit of.
Okay, sorry. Okay.
So what we're saying is, if the case is trying to prove that there are certain appropriate things to do in the public domain and certain not. In other words, wherever there is a reason that's reasonable. So, for example, to adjust a heavy load is reasonable. The very fact that the Gemara says you're not liable in that case, it's suggesting here that the Mishnah should have been reworded differently, or the Brisa. And what is that? It should have said, when he stops to adjust his load, which is reasonable in the public domain, he is not liable. But if he just stopped to look at the scenery and smell the roses, he is liable. So the Gemara is saying that why didn't it word it like that, since we know there's no liability in that particular case? Okay, questions after, with pleasure. So it's saying the very fact that it didn't introduce a case of liability and not liability is proof that you need to issue a warning. Okay? In other words, the Gemara says that perhaps the fact that the Tana introduces a different case altogether, where he gave a warning to illustrate non-liability, implies that the original case, where he stopped without giving a warning, he is always liable, even if he stopped only to adjust his load. So the one Tana said, listen, even if it's a reasonable thing that you're adjusting your load, you're still liable because of the way the Mishnah is structured. So if the Mishnah was structured in a different way, it would teach the distinction of liability and not liability for activity. But the fact that it gave the Mishnah in a particular way it does, this particular Tana says that, this particular commentary on the Tana said that the issue here was discussing about warning and liability. So the Gemara answered that the Tana possibly holds that one is not liable where he has stopped only to adjust his load. So there's two different explanations of the Tana. The one said the Tana actually brought this law to show that if you don't warn, even if you're doing a legitimate activity, you're liable. But if you read the exact words of this Brisa, what it's saying very clearly is that the Tana says if you're adjusting your load, you're not liable. So why was a different case used? Because he wished to teach a novel point of law. So let me tell you what this novel point of law is. Even where the owner of the beam stopped to rest, in other words, which is abnormal use of the public domain, if he said to the owner of the barrel, stop, he is not liable. So what is this proving, Gavin? Just because sometimes, guys, I need to cover a bit of ground before you ask questions. Otherwise, it disrupts the flow. Gavin, what we're saying is here, it was structured in such a way to teach a novel point of law. Even if you're doing something irregular in the public domain, like stopping when there's a pace, as long as you're warning people, then you're off the hook. It's the same as though that when you're slowing down your car, maybe you can't find a place, that you put on your hazards lights or you put on your hooter or something to let the person know that you are struggling with something. You can't find the house or something like that. If you just suddenly come to a stop because you're seeing if it's the right wording on the road, in other words, that's the right street now, and you're going to have a car smack into you. But if you put your hazards lights on about 100 meters and start to slow down, in that case, it gets you off the hook, even if you're slowing down at an abnormal pace, which is not appropriate for that road. So that's what the Tana is coming to teach. It's not necessarily coming to teach that you're liable if you're doing something normal, like adjusting a load on your shoulder. It's saying even if you're doing something abnormal, you could still get off the hook as long as you warn somebody. Fair enough?
Fair enough.
Okay, good. One last point, and then we finish for the daf. I'm making today very short. Okay. The Gemara attempts another proof. Come learn a proof from the following brisa. If potters or glassware merchants were walking one behind another, and the first fell, and the second stumbled over the first, and the third stumbled over the second. The first is liable for damages to the second, and the second is liable for damages to the third. I mean, guys, that's obvious. The one impacts on the other. And if in other words, both the second and the third fell because of the first is liable for damages to all of them. Now, I just want to clear up a quick point. What we're saying is not the first one was the battler. You could say, of course, the first one is responsible for the two. Why? Because the first one caused the second one to trip to cause the third one to trip. So that seems to contradict that the first damages the second, he's liable. Then if the second, out of falling over the first, damages the third, he is liable. But then if it says that the first one that damaged both of them is liable, how could the second one be liable for damaging the third? We're saying there are two different cases. The one case is the knock-on effect. We always hold the catalyst, the person responsible for causing damage, for the next knock-on, meaning the first person fell, and then the second person fell on top of him. And then the third person fell on top of the second, or was tripped by him. So we're saying that the second one is liable because he also should have watched where he was going and maybe kept the correct falling distance. Therefore, he's liable to the third. But his liability to the third is not as stringent as the first one's liability to the second, because the second obviously got tripped over that person. It's not like he just stumbled for nothing. You know what I'm saying? So why are we saying that the first is responsible for the second and the third? We're only saying in a case if he fell on the road like this, and both of them tripped over that one person. In other words, they have to both directly fall over the first person for the first person to be financially responsible for the second and third person. But if the second person if the first person tripped, then the second person tripped on the first, and then the third tripped on the second, the first person only has to pay for the second, and the second person only has to pay the third. Now, what we're going to learn is we're going to learn that the degree of payment is less as it goes down the line because the level of responsibility is less. In the meantime, this is the Chiddush. But if they warned one another, they are not liable, which means when the first one fell, he said, man down the manhole, then he's off the hook. And then if the second one tripped on the first one and said, an idiot fell, I'm falling, then you're off the hook. The second guy and the third guy obviously has got no one to warn because there was no one behind him. So as long as they warn, they're in the clear. Okay? So what happens in that particular case is the first part of this brisa teaches that each potter is liable for damage sustained by the next. Now, does this not refer to a case when they could not get up in time? Yet the brisa teaches that each one is liable. So what it's doing, Gavin, is it's reiterating its first point. It's saying, listen, but if we learned in the beginning of the Mishnah with this case of the sages and Rav Yochanan, etc., and Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak, that the person couldn't get up in time. Why would the second person be responsible? And why would the first person be responsible? Because it was beyond their control. They can't get up in time because they really did injure themselves badly. Okay? So we say, yet the brisa teaches that they're liable, because the brisa is saying, why are they liable if they couldn't get up in time? This must be because each should have warned the next person. That is, basically, they're held accountable for not warning others after they're falling. So the argument repeats itself exactly as in the beginning, saying, listen, it doesn't matter if the first person warned, fell, and couldn't get up in time, as long as he warned the second. And if the second one fell and didn't warn the third, then he's liable. So the problem here is the lack of warning. So the Gemara actually isn't happy with this. It deflects this proof. It says, no, the brisa speaks only of a case where they were able to get up in time. Accordingly, each is liable because he did not get up rather than because he failed to warn the person behind him. Okay? Meaning that the Gemara isn't happy in saying it's a case of warning. It was saying, listen, all of these guys, it wasn't a hectic fall. They could have got up in time. Their failure to get up in time is the reason for the issue. And guys, we're going to be finished in about 3 minutes. The Gemara challenges this interpretation of the brisa. But according to the answer, what is the law if they were not able to get up in time? So the Gemara says, fine, I get that. If nobody was able to get up in time because they were injured, then they're only liable because, why? They didn't issue a warning. They were able to get up in time, liable because they never got up in time. And they should have reacted properly when they weren't that injured. So the law is that each is not liable. So in other words, but according to this answer, what is the law if they were not able to get up in time? The law teaches that each is not liable. Instead of teaching in the end of the brisa, if they warned one another, they are not liable. The Tana should have taught a distinction between liability and non-liability in this very case. Where the potters did not warn each other by stating, when is this law? They are liable stated, where they were able to get up in time. But if they were not able to get up in time, they are not liable. The fact that the Tana introduces a different case altogether, they gave a warning, is to illustrate non-liability implies that in the original case, where they did not give a warning, they are always liable, even if they did not have time to rise. So what are we saying here is as follows, is that if you want to teach a point of liability, just say, listen, in a case where they couldn't get up in time, they're not liable. Okay, I get that. And if they could have got up in time, they're liable, then I get that too. But why did the brisa word it in such a weird way? Isn't it to prove that if you didn't give a warning, if you couldn't get up, then, if you could get up, and you, in that particular case, if you could get up and you issued a warning, that you'd be off the hook and that warning was sufficient. So it's saying, no, it's not necessarily the case. If you could get up and you didn't get up, you're liable for the fact that you never got up in time. It's not necessarily the fact that you didn't give a warning. So the brisa then is proving that the Tana possibly holds that they did not have time to rise, and therefore they're not liable, okay, if they didn't have time to rise. The reason why the Tana chose a different example, in other words, where they gave a warning, as an example of non-liability is as follows. And this is the Chiddush, guys. This is the novel teaching. This is what he is teaching us. Even when they were able to get up, if they warned one another, they are not liable. So what we're saying here is something else. Is you're saying, say they were negligent because they could have got up in time, they never injured themselves that badly, and they failed to get up. even if they did something wrong, like the guy resting in the public domain that did something wrong that shouldn't have looked up to smell the roses, so to speak, the very fact that a person like that gives a warning and saying, listen, I could get up in time, I'm just like gathering my thoughts or whatever, but stop, then he's off the hook. So both of these Bryces teach a novel law that even if you're doing something wrong, if you give a warning, you're off the hook. Does that make sense? Even if you're doing something wrong. All right, guys, we've got about 6 minutes left. I'm finished. Do you have any questions?
No, but thanks, Kirk. I've got to actually go. Thanks, Kirk. And
I'm fine as well.
All right, guys, have a
Shabbat
wonderful
Shalom.
day.
Shabbat Shalom.
Nah.
to
Shabbat
everybody.
Shalom, guys.
Shalom. Cheers.
Ciao.
Okay. All right, guys, the first thing I wanted to do is I wanted to officially thank Rabbi Cohen for all the help that he's given us. I mean, I consider us sometimes like we're stumbling in the dark, and it said in the Valley of the Blind, the one-eyed man is king. I consider myself at best to have one eye, at best. And Rabbi Cohen is like somebody that not only has two eyes, but can see the forest for the trees, meaning that because he's got such a broad knowledge of the Talmud in Shas and everything else, I'm like looking at one tree and a half of another tree and stumbling my way through. And it's like he's in a helicopter with an aerial view of how this Gemara relates to every other Gemara he's done in Shas. And that sort of 3D perspective of seeing the forest for the trees is something that I can never give you guys. You know what I'm saying? As much as I've practiced the daf or whatever I've done, and I'd just like to thank Rabbi Cohen for all his help. I mean, whenever we've had questions and I asked him, like I had an issue with Rav Yochanan, he answered it. He spent a bit of time, he did his research, and he came back with a 2 minute and 20-second answer that was so succinct, it was unbelievable. So I just wanted to make a note to thank him, because I'm hoping that he'll just watch this excerpt of the clip and know how much we appreciate him.
Absolutely.
Behind the scenes, and I think he's also very pleased with the work that you've all been doing, because it's not the work that I've been doing. I might happen to, as learning with my friends, be the one to maybe deliver the message, but we've all done we've all done work on this, and you've all put in a year into this. And I really want to thank all of you for helping me learn, because sometimes when I get lazy or I'm not in the mood, somebody's relying on you, it makes a difference. I mean, sometimes I used to set business appointments in my 20s first thing in the morning, because you can sit there and work from home in your pajamas all day. If you set business appointments first thing in the morning, you get dressed, you get ready. It's the discipline of a routine, which is also very, very important. And I want to thank you guys very much for being part of that, really, because you've helped my learning. I mean, sometimes I want to sit on the couch and watch a series or a movie. But no, really, because you've had a tired day. But what you guys have helped me done is say, listen, I've got a responsibility here, and you've helped me. So thank you for that. All right, let's get.
Thank you. Otherwise,
Thank you, Damon.
You've helped us a lot as well. It's good for all of us.
Yeah, I think this is good for all of us, actually.
We're all winning here, and it was fantastic of you to actually put this group together, to have the initiative, to take the initiative, and to really slog away at this, because you knew it at actually teaching, So this is incredible. You've come a long way. Well done.
Shkat. Kol hakavod.
Pleasure. You know what? I'm not naturally always so self-disciplined, because of one particular reason, is that sometimes, like, for example, if I'm going to do gym, I just know that I think of all the work ahead and the schlepping of weights and the pushing and the lifting. It's funny, you see Goyim go to the gym and they lift weights. It's like, happy birthday. They're busy there and they're pushing and they're schlepping and they're excited about it. And I look at all these weights and I look at all these exercises and my knees buckle from sheer exhaustion just imagining it. And with Goyim, it's like happy birthday. It's like getting a flat tire in the middle of a highway. A Jew wants to sell his car, and a Goy thinks happy birthday, comes out there with the spanner and the jack, and he changes the tire like it's nothing. Gym and changing tires is not something that's natural for a Jewish person. So what I have to do to get ready for gym is I just got to think to get to the gym. Once I'm at the gym, it takes care of itself. It's pretty much everything for life. Sometimes I don't feel like learning the daf, but I say, all right, let me just open the book. And then I say, let me read a paragraph. And when I read a paragraph and you're ready into it, you say, okay, what did they say about this? So these are mind tricks that you play on yourself that really, really help you with self-discipline. One more thing I want to leave you guys with, which is an important message, is that the very difficult thing, whether you're doing gym or you're learning the daf, is you don't go to the gym, pump out, and then see results immediately. It can take months. It can take even years to see proper results. But the failure to do so is going to leave a detrimental mark on you. If you don't brush your teeth, you're not going to notice it. But if you don't do it for a year, you're going to look like that person on the Colgate ad, the before picture, not the after picture. So the thing of it is the sort of instantaneous reward. Hashem doesn't do that for us. We've got to have the end goal in mind, and we've got to have the picture, but you don't see results immediately. You don't see results by going to the gym for 9 hours in one session. You see results for going 90 times.
All the water all over my fucking table here.
Right, I'm going to have to edit out that F for Rabbi Khan. It's not that he hasn't heard it before. And that little snake with fur that Arthur's got. What does that come out? Arthur, you're right.
He thinks he's on mute, I'm sure. He had no idea. That's it. Well, you know what? You're going to cut this out, though, eh?
This little bit, yeah, not the first.
Yeah. So there's a guy in the DA in America, not the DA, in the Democratic Party there, and they were doing a Zoom session. He's a senior politician. He sits on the thing, on the legislative thing like that. And during the middle of a thing, he was jerking off.
That was a guy, CNN analyst, a Jewish guy as well. Don't forget that.
How do you know he was Jewish? But you see, he was circumcised by jerking off.
No. I saw the report. No, I didn't watch it.
I thought maybe the video showed more than I thought.
And this is one of these guys. Trump is evil. Trump is immoral. They're all the biggest hypocrites. These people. That's all the biggest hypocrites. These people.
It's everything. My cell phone, my electronics, my computer.
Literally with their pants down. He's not the only one.
I don't do a thing anymore.
He just literally not figurative.
Yesterday, into that.
Damon, can you mute him?
I'm just going to edit that part out. All right, Kev, you're going to teach us because I want to add that. You teaching us, and then we'll go for the Gemara.
Can I just do? Just go through the introduction still. Because or should I just do the malachot?
No, do whatever you want to do, just as long as.
Yeah, I've never done that. Yeah, whatever's going to be value add for us.
We trust you, Kev.
Okay, yeah, this is nice. Okay, so it's part of the introduction. So this book is called, I don't know, I found this at the old Awesome bookshop many years ago. Remember the tape library, Northfield Avenue? Yeah, it was like, what did this cost? It was like 33 Rand. Do you know how long ago that was?
You can add on a zero at least, not more.
Exactly. Okay, so observing Sabbath. Shamor. Shamor means, represents a mitzvah which forbids 39 types of creative activity or malachot. And Zachor, which means, represents the oneg. It means to remember, actually. Zachor or Zecher, this means to remember in Hebrew. Represents the oneg, which means enjoyment of the day, and its various forms of festivity. By the two words being pronounced together, we can learn a further lesson, which teaches us how to